The name Weel-lunk has been getting a lot of attention lately, and our guest today is Alan Fitzpatrick. His new book is called Place of the Skull, in which he explains the origins of the name. Here he is, Alan Fitzpatrick.
Gee, I want to thank everyone for coming out today, this tough weather day, and especially thank Sean and the library for having me. And what I'm going to talk about today is a marvelous mystery that's local, and it's the mystery of how Wheeling got its name. And what makes it, I think, so great is it's got so many elements. There's a legend that we'll get into. And usually with legends, what that means, there's things that are true about a legend. Just like when you do your family tree, if you've done it, you'll find things that are true. You find things that are not true. You're going to find things that you'll never know. And then there's the unexpected, where you find something that perhaps you wish you didn't know. That makes a great story. What makes the story of Wheeling's earliest history, I think, outstanding is that there's a paradox involved, that where things seem to be a certain way or not, they're the opposite, and we'll get into that. And then finally, there's irony involved, and the irony in this case is that there was a race of people here that are now gone, that our ancestors 200 years ago did not understand. And I'm talking about the Native Americans, and they were central to the story here in Wheeling, and we don't have them here to tell their part of it, and so I'm going to try and fill in the blanks. There's three reasons why I wrote this book, and the first one has to do with a Wheeling historian, Margaret Brennan, and Margaret was instrumental in sort of teasing me and prompting me. One day we had a conversation here in the library, and she said, you know, there's a great mystery about how Wheeling got its name. And a fellow named Delph Nerona looked into it back in the 50s, but nobody's, for 200 years, nobody's examined it to see just what happened and how it got its name. And I remember her getting up and leaving and saying, you know, somebody should look into that one day. And it's as if Margaret knew that she was giving me the prompt. That was one reason. The second reason is when I wrote my first book, Wilderness War on the Ohio, something unusual came up in the research I was doing. And that research was into the British archives from England, and it was letters that men in the Ohio country during the American Revolution were fighting with the Indians. I kept coming up with references where Indians were speaking to them, and they wrote it down, that they wanted to go to a place called Wheeling. And I thought that they wanted to go because they wanted to fight, or they wanted to wage war there, and that was highly unusual to me. I don't think that the white men are writing this down knew the import of it, and I didn't know, but it seemed like there was some sort of legacy, that there was something about this place, something dark about this place called Wheeling, that every Indian seemed to know about. And I presumed a lot who had never been here. And this is sort of like, if I can, there's a place in Poland I've never been to, and it's called Auschwitz. And but I know that something happened there, and that something evil happened there. And so the fact these Indians were talking about Wheeling and wanting white men to accompany them there had some of the same elements to it. And then number three, we all know the story about the Battle of Fort Henry, the siege where Ebenezer Zane runs for the gunpowder. That's now called the last battle in that war. But one thing that's never been examined and never questioned is why would Indians contrary to every manner in which they waged war, spend 3 days at a frontier fort when they had no hope of taking it, they had no artillery. What was it about that? Why was it so personal? And so this, to me, seemed like the legacy of something else, that this was that this was something connected with this place. And so, saying all that, on the other hand, to begin to examine this, I thought I needed to borrow something from TV, and so I said to myself, you know, this is a cold case, and I'm going to be a detective. There was, if we look at the legend alone, which we'll get into, there was a murder here. There was a victim. There was a murderer. There's no body. There's no living witnesses. And, oh, yeah, small detail. Over 200 years have passed since whatever it was happened, if it's in fact true. And so how do you approach something like that? To say, I want to know the who, what, when, where, and why. If something happened here, and that's an if, it's unproven. If something happened here that ended up naming this place that's lasted as long as it has, how do we begin to look at that? And so and what I'm going to do here is, rather than talk about the book directly, I'm talking about the main points of how I came about to write this, and we'll end up at the same place. Key to me was two clues. One was the legend, and one was the naming of this creek, because they go hand in hand. And the legend is, and we'll look at that first, and let's keep a tag on date. 1769 is an important date. The first English settlers west of the Allegheny Mountains arrived at what we call Wheeling. And that was Ebenezer Zane and his two brothers. And Ebenezer Zane called this place a vision of paradise. This was just a beautiful place, this land here along the river. And so they decided to settle. And somewhere within a year or two, and there's no Indian war going on, he talks to, and the legend says, an elderly Delaware Lenape Indian, who tells him that this place's name has a name, and that the name is Weel-lunk, and that's an Indian word in the Delaware language. Now, that is legend, and I was reminded all the elements of legend here back in November, because I was talking about the book, and a lady looked at it and she said, I hate to tell you this, but you're wrong. Wheeling was named because they made wagon wheels here in Wheeling in the 1800s. And she said, I can't write it. And so, that's the nature of legend, is we want to believe certain things are true, and Zane had few words about this other than the Indian said that a white man had lost his head, had it cut off and put on a post down by what now is WesBanco. And in the Delaware language, the name for that is Weel-lunk. Weel-lunk, two Delaware words. So what we have today is, if that legend is true, is an English language corruption of Weel-lunk. 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 Wheeling. You see the English. And Weel-lunk is a locative in the Delaware language, and that means place of. And wheel means the scalped head or skull. Place of the skull. That's what this Indian name meant. And so Zane never attached a date to that, but we know that, and by the way, the Indian never attached a date to it. But we know that it was something that happened, if this was true, prior to 1769. And so the next clue I had came from a a white man named John Heckewelder, who was a Moravian, German Moravian minister to the Delaware. And he spent a lot of time in the Schoenbrunn area. There were some Christian Delaware villages there. And he kept copious notes, and he has in his notes that two Delaware Indians told him the same story. And that they added to it that this white man who lost his head, this had happened during, quote, one of their previous wars. And so I got to think of previous wars. You know, the only war, knowing what had happened here on the frontier, the only war previous to 1769 was the French and Indian War. They must be, these Delaware must be making reference to that. And that was 1755 to 1760. Okay, so we got a rough time. And I started to think, well, gee, they named the creek. I wonder if any, because and let's remember, pre-1769, there's no settlers here. There's none. Zanes were the first. So was there any other white man come through here who might shed some light on it? And I came up with a map by a fellow named Lewis Evans, who published a map in 1755. Now that means he got this information prior, probably a year before. So we're looking at 1754, source unknown, in which you can see the creek named Wheeling, W-E-E-L-I-N-G, and Wheeling Island. So we're getting closer, but there's some problems coming up because the French and Indian War didn't start to that part of the legend, and so a defining moment came when I looked at, and there was a white surveyor, an Englishman from Virginia, Christopher Gist, who in 1751 was hired by a group of wealthy Virginia businessmen to come across the mountains and take a look at the land on the Ohio River, because they had it in their interest that they wanted to claim this land sooner or later and sell it and make a fortune, because land was not available east of the mountains. And so Christopher Gist hired an unnamed Delaware Indian, and he and this Delaware and his son came up the Ohio from the Kanawha, and he was literate, so he kept a journal, and he stops along a creek that he calls Wheeling, W-E-A-L-I-N. And I have the quote in the book here, and he says, we stopped and we went up the creek and we followed an Indian trail, and the hunting was excellent because of the island. Everything was lower, water was lower, but animals would get trapped on the island, and so it was good hunting. And that now caused a problem. 1751, you say. The Delaware had to have been wrong. And that part of the legend. And to boot, the Delaware only came here, migrated here. They were from eastern Pennsylvania. We got into this a little bit when we were talking about the migration of Indian tribes. And they came from the Susquehanna Valley. They were pushed out and came across the mountains. 1749, 1750, somewhere in there, started showing up the Pittsburgh area now. There was a couple villages. And so some of this legend's wrong, at least from the Delaware point of view, because there's no war. This is pre-war. The French and Indian War went on for several years. And so I thought, I better take a look at somebody else who was here, and you probably all know that story about Celeron de Blainville. That's who put sort of Wheeling on the map. That he was a Frenchman who came from Canada, and the French in New France decided to claim this land for France, and they buried lead plates along the way. And one place they stopped was a creek that they pulled into and buried a plate, and it happened to be this creek here. Now, what did they say about the creek? What did Celeron say about it? When I examined his journal, and Celeron was literate, kept notes, kept a lot of notes. Every time they stopped, he would take notes of what he's seen. And he also had with him a French priest, Boncounts, who also kept his own set of notes. And we all, if you know that story, and they went on down the river and buried lead plates, what's not talked about in that story is who was with them. Because Celeron had an entourage, besides his own Frenchmen, of Iroquois Indians, which is interesting because this puts the Delaware legend out of the picture. And the Iroquois Indians that are with him are there because they claimed all this land by conquest, starting in the late 1600s. And they were the ones who allowed the Delaware to migrate here. And they were the ones who named the creek. And what did they name it? Not Weel-lunk, Canoraron. That's what, and it's in both diaries. And Canoraron is a Iroquois word. And so when you look at the two diaries of the two Frenchmen, all they do is name the creek, phonetically spelling it out in their own language, Canoraron. And it was Dalton Arona in the 50s who went to a Iroquois language dictionary and did a lot of research, because here you're taking an Indian word and phonetically trying to spell it into English. There's all kinds of problems. A lot of times you have to sound the word out. And he was able to find in the Iroquois language that the word for head is Anora, with an A, and that Canoraron was a locative. So, of all things, the creek is already named in 1749, place of the skull. The Delaware simply translated it when they came into their own language. And neither tribe had any written history, and so we know oral history can get changed. I'll give you an example. My English grandmother passed down the story that her husband, my grandfather, had his family had come from Ireland, that they were from Ulster County, they were Orangemen, they were Protestant, Irish, and that this was a story she had heard and he had heard, and she passed this down. The problem with it was, as with oral stories, there was no truth to it whatsoever. And when I did the genealogy, I found out, gee, they came much earlier. They were illiterate Catholic, indentured, that the fellow fought in the American Revolution, but on the wrong side. And that's how they ended up. I was born and raised in Canada. That's how they ended up in Canada. And that this sort of dark secret got buried, and this other story sounded a lot better. Getting back to we're now at 1749. That's earlier than anybody has ever thought. The creek is named. The Iroquois know the meaning. They don't tell Celeron what it means. They just say and by the way, they were the ones who urged Celeron to bury the plate here. We think Celeron said, yeah, that creek there, I'll take that one. They already knew where it was, what it meant. And so this event that this legend is based upon was earlier than Celeron's arrival. The other thing that's interesting to note is that nowhere in either journal of these Frenchmen do they mention seeing a skull on a post. That's part of the legend. No skull on a post. They would have made notice of it. They made notice of so many things up in the, they stopped at different places on the Ohio River above us. And so there's no skull on a stick. Well, that's troubling for the whole story, except for the fact that if any of you go out in the woods, and if you have friends that are hunters or you're hunters, how many deer skulls, animal skulls, do you see in the woods? The fact of the matter is, a bone skull will only last 3, 4, maybe 5 years at the most before it dissolves, meaning falls apart, animals pick it apart. So that they did not find a skull on a stick or on a pole in 1749 does not mean that it was not there. It just pushes the time back earlier. And now we're at 1744 to 1745. And I said to myself, gee, it sounds like a dead end. The whole thing is a dead end. There's no white settlers. There's no Delaware Indians. There's Iroquois. And by the way, what the Iroquois had done over a period of 30 years had depopulated the Ohio Valley. And only through war, they had driven out the Shawnee, driven out any tribes that were here. And so in the early 1730s, to try and cement their conquest as they were losing their military might. And I'm talking about the confederation called the Iroquois. That was the Cayuga, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, and the Seneca. There's 5 tribes centered in upstate New York who had this range all the way to the Mississippi River at one time. That they started to do what throughout history, other societies have done, warlike societies, is transplant their own people. And so they started, especially the Seneca, who were on the west, started to send families, groups of families, to settle down the Ohio River at different. And so we know that to be a fact. And when you know, if you know the story about Chief Logan, anybody know that story? Chief Logan above Toronto, Ohio, on the Yellow Creek there was a village. And that Logan was a transplant. His family were from Pennsylvania and from upstate New York. He was a part Cayuga, part Oneida. So he was one, those Iroquois had migrated down the valley. So 1744, 1745, there can't be any white man here. LaSalle was a Frenchman, was the first in the 1680s, the first to see the Ohio Valley. There's nobody else, or so I thought. And with no place to turn, I turned to the earliest Pennsylvania archives, and I turned to the minutes of the council meeting in Philadelphia. And this was a Quaker, Pennsylvania was a Quaker colony. It dominated in the 1730s and 1740s. And lo and behold, I come across what I thought I was looking for. There was a conflict going on. And the conflict was that as Indians started to move into the Ohio Valley, a handful of white men crossed the Susquehanna River at Harris's Ferry and took trade goods across the Allegheny Mountains, a 3-week trip. A string of horses, pack horses, and they brought trade goods to the Indians this side in their villages, mainly north of here. And that this was because Indians could not take their hides in any bulk east. Indians didn't have many horses. White men did. And here was the interesting thing. On their heels was somebody else. A lot of them were former employees of the traders, because a trader would have to have 4, 5, 6 men with him to handle all these horses on this long trip. And these were a class of people, the most despicable of the time, white men, and for lack of, and what the minutes, the council minutes called them rum traders. And that rum traders were men coming across the mountains, bringing nothing but alcohol to the Indians, because they understood that, and there's an old saying that Indians can't hold their liquor. They understood that if they got native people drunk in their villages, that they could strip them of they would trade everything. And that this started in the 1730s, and so when I went through the minutes, there's licensed traders coming back to Philadelphia saying, hey, these guys, you've got to do something. These white men are not only debauching the Indians, they're stripping them of everything that they own. They get them drunk, they take all their furs, they take off, they get there before the licensed trader does. When he arrives, the Indians have nothing to trade, and if they owe them money, they can't pay that debt. And so here's a handful, we're talking less than 30 or 40 white men in the Ohio Valley in the 1730s, and it became increasing into the 1740s. They're coming across the Allegheny Path that goes through today through several Pennsylvania towns, but there were several trails that wound their way, one to what's now Pittsburgh, one to above what's some of the villages that were north of there, and that they were. There was a conflict not only with their contemporaries, but a growing conflict with the Indians, because the Indians realized that they were absolutely helpless when it came to alcohol, and that they, in saner moments, realized they had to do something. They had to try and stop this. Pennsylvania government couldn't stop it. Their Pennsylvania ended at the Susquehanna. They had nobody west of the mountains. There was no soldiers, no sheriffs, no nothing. And on top of that is the rumor that there were prominent Quakers looking the other way who were involved in the rum trade, because rum was very cheap to import, that were making fortunes in Philadelphia selling it to these rum traders, and that they didn't want this disturbed. And that while they pitied the Indians and felt a kinship with them, money and greed overruled all that. And so we have an explosive situation. There's a handful of these rum traders west of the mountains, and it's about 1742 that the first violence erupts. And part of it is at the hands of some French men who had been adopted by the Shawnee, because there's now Shawnee present, there's Iroquois present, there's some Delaware coming into the area, and that these Frenchmen said, we need to drive these English rum traders out. Not in a war, but to expel them from our villages. And so here's the white men that are in the Ohio Valley. They're going all the way down the river. They're taking canoes past Wheeling. We know that they're going to the Shawnee villages on the Scioto River in Ohio, that they're going as far as the Miami villages, which would be now Cincinnati, on the Great Miami River. There was villages there. They're going all the way down there. A lot of times they'd come into the village, break open a keg of rum, get the Indians drunk. They'd be rip-roaring drunk. They'd gather up all the furs. They'd paddle out of there the same day. Sometimes the Indians would sober up and and give chase the next day, trying to get their furs back. But it was an explosive time, and by 1744, there's evidence that there's violence erupting. And so here we have Iroquois Indians living here, a handful of unscrupulous rum traders going up and down the river. And so what can we deduce happened? There's no other white men. There's no village in Wheeling. There's no village here. But let's go back to Gist's description, because he said it was good hunting, and there was an Indian trail, and we know that that trail went on the north side of Wheeling Creek from what's now WesBanco, headed east, went all the way to what's now Washington and split. And at Elm Grove split there, so that if you were an Indian traveling from the Great Lakes, you could come down, because the trail crossed the island on the southern end and headed west on the north bank of what's now Route 40, and went all the way into the interior. At Blaine, a fork went up to the Great Lakes. So you could travel from the Great Lakes down to Chesapeake Bay and trade with the English. This had been going on for generations. And so what it also was going on is Wheeling is an ideal, the site where the WesBanco is in that area, was an ideal place for families to come and set up a hunting camp. Okay. And so we have, in a hunting camp typically, because there's no war. Indians are not fighting with each other, nor are they fighting with white men. So the men go off up the creek, Elm Grove area, up hunting. The women stay in camp. They're dressing the hides for trade. They're curing the meat. And all it takes is the unexpected, which likely was a rum trader or group of them stopped, seen the camp and stopped. And so now we come down to motive. What happened? And we need to know, and everything I've said up to this point is looking at it from the perspective of our ancestors. I say our, English, Irish people who colonized this area. We've got to look at it from the point of view of Native American people. And I said earlier, our ancestors knew virtually nothing about them, how they viewed the world, what they thought, their culture. And so to look at this through their eyes, if they killed a white man, it either, and whites have always explained this through history, it was a random act of violence. These were savages, capable of doing anything, and so it was just another random act of violence. No. There is virtually less than 2 or 3 over a 50-year period where Indians cut off somebody's head and put it on a post. It was so rare. Was it trophy taking that we did that? No. A good example of when Major Robert Rogers destroyed the Abenaki village in north of Lake Champlain during the French and Indian War. They found 700 white scalps hanging from in the village, but no heads. So no heads. Cutting off somebody's head and putting it on a post was something very, very significant, and not something done randomly. So when we look at Native people, what's at the top of their list in cultural motivation? And I'm going to use some today that you can look at. Because at the top of the list of tribal people in Pakistan, in the northern provinces, Waziristan, these are tribal people. Afghanistan is tribal people. What is their number one motivation in life? Cultural. Demand vengeance. And so was it with Native American people, the Woodland Indian, vengeance. You live in, and the closest I can describe this is the Old Testament eye for an eye. And I caught on the BBC here 2 weeks ago a fellow who was a former governor of Waziristan in Pakistan, who was born and raised there, and he said this was just after the Pakistani Taliban killed those children. And he says, the West does not understand. This was a vengeance. This was revenge. That it was children didn't matter. These blood feuds go on for 200, 300 years. They've been going on for 3,000. Vengeance has to be fulfilled. And it usually, when an eye for an eye, and if we look at what happened at here, this incident, it would take murder to be avenged by murder. It was not a random act that they killed a white man who happened to be passing by. More than likely, a rum trader killed a woman or child and was caught. Now, that does not explain yet why he put his head on a post. Because that's something beyond vengeance. And so we need to look at Native American people. And they looked at things differently than we do. And traditionally today they look at things differently. They don't see the same world we see. Traditional. I've seen in the Southwest Native people who refuse to have electricity and water, who live the traditional way. They live in a more spirit world. They are unencumbered by all our language that makes distinctions. They live more with the heart than the head. Their language allows them to do that. In general, and this applies to 18th century, they seen, they could hear things in the wind. They seen things in the way the grass moved. There was messages. The raven was a messenger, a literal physical manifestation that from the spirit world that brought visions. That's why the feathers in the hair. Nobody's ever asked them why do we always see Indians with feathers in their hair? That brought visions, that brought messages from the afterlife. And so they were more in tune with nature than we are. Now what's that got to do with cutting somebody's head off? This act was symbolic. It was not a trophy. I think I forgot to say in the beginning that the part of the legend was it was a warning to other white men to stay out. This was not a warning to other white men. It was symbolic. The person who did it symbolically. Number one, vengeance has been fulfilled, and I did that. But they've seen the world different, and I'm going to give an example. If we see that man over there kill that man there, we say he's guilty. We're going to try him and punish him. But it's unfortunate, but it's a random act. Nothing was random to Native people, and nothing is random to traditional Native people today. And so when I say that, they see no distinction between an evil act and the person who did it and the place it happened in. The place it happened in. Because they believed that evil spirits inhabiting places and people, and that nothing is random, and so they didn't separate it. And so where something bad happened, we said, well, that's, we don't say that the killing at Sandy Hook of those innocent children, that there was something evil about the place. We say, well, there was a deranged shooter, terrible act. but the school itself is not at fault. The land is not at fault. Not so Native American. Culture, religion, they see no distinction. And so an evil act by an evil person, by an evil place, there's an evil spirit involved in all three. And so that starts to explain a little bit about the legacy that would go on at Wheeling that didn't involve white people, because white people didn't buy into that. And that, let's take it a step further, that by cutting the head off of the murderer was not just an act of vengeance at an evil place. You see the person doing that now in native view is now possessed by the evil spirit. Right? No, if he cut the head off and put it on a post, the spirit of the dead person cannot move on to the afterlife. It's caught. And that is a sacrifice to the evil spirit so that the person doing it gets off the hook. You see, and what we have here, when C.C. Rose, the artist, is painted, is that the raven from, which is a little symbolic manifestation of the afterlife, is holding or keeping guard on the spirit so that the person who did it can walk away without being contaminated by it. What was it all meant? Here's the paradox that I found. It was a warning, but not to white people to stay out. It was a warning to other Indians that this was a place of evil, of white man's evil towards Indians. So that 2 generations later, Indians who've never been here, I've never been to Auschwitz, that's 2 generations remote or a generation remote. Indians who had never been here knew that they didn't know the details. The Delaware didn't know the details, but they knew that something bad had happened here. We look at it and say, well, people are killed every day. Murder happens every day. It's random. Not to Native people. It was very significant. This place was known to Indians all the way to Indiana who'd never been here. And the legacy that went on until the end of the Indian Wars in 1782, 1783, they believed everything that bad happened to them came from Wheeling. And so, even when it wasn't true. The expedition to the Moravian Massacre had some white men from Wheeling, but most were from Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. But to the Indians, they came from Wheeling. And there's many instances of that. Logan came to believe that the people who killed his family came from Wheeling. They were here at Wheeling, but they weren't from Wheeling. But in his mind, he knew the story, because he was Iroquois. He knew that there was an evil spirit here. A white man's spirit, evil spirit, that brought nothing but harm to Indians. And so Place of the Skull was a warning to other Indians that this is a place of evil to them. And they tried unsuccessfully in 1782 to try and right that wrong. And here's the final paradox or irony that I'll end with is that the man who founded Wheeling, Ebenezer Zane, staunch, God-fearing Christian, a man who lived by his wits. He's one of the few who survived the war, and Sam McCullough didn't. And we know Ebenezer Zane was able, at the end of the siege, was able to walk away. He could have called this place, this could have been Zanesburg, Zanestown, Zanesburg. He didn't change the name. Why? He was also very superstitious about Indians. He had a brother, Isaac. See, they were captured as children. Isaac never came back. Isaac was adopted by the Wyandot in the Dayton area and lived his life there. Ebenezer was superstitious and thought, I'm going to let sleeping dogs lay. And today we have Wheeling, place in the skull. I'd like to take some questions now. And I'm sorry, before I do, C.C. Rose, the artist, was there anything you wanted to say about the painting?
Well, you put me on the spot now. The idea was just to reiterate this idea of the bird being the connection with the other world, and placed on this skull of the lost soul. It's sort of trying to make this connection between the afterworld and the person that's deceased. So it's a Native American tradition. Can everybody hear me?
No.
Basically, it's just to bring about this idea that the Native Americans believe that the bird, the raven, is a carrier of the spirit of the dead, or connects with the spirit of the dead. And very symbolic, if they see a raven somewhere, it might mean that a person near them is going to pass away or whatever. A lot of artists out in the Southwest use this imagery. And a lot of the Native Americans wear it, like he said, in their headdress. But the connection here was to almost appear that the bird is trying to find something for this person that's been killed. So it's a malevolent thing. On the one hand, it looks spooky or whatever, but on the other hand, it's this raven trying to help this poor soul find the rest of its spirit, a spirit guide. So.
And there's a great story goes with that. Her and I were set up at Arts Fest this past June at downtown Wheeling, and she had all her paintings, and she had the original. Was that oil? She had the original hanging on the back of one of her partitions, and I'm talking about the book, and a fella comes up out of nowhere, real serious, and he says, "Where's the painting?" And I said, I just didn't feel. I said, "Of what?" He says, "Of that." And he pointed to the book. I said, "Well, I have the book." He says, "I don't want the book." He said, I'm looking for the painting. Well, I could see her next to me. She was doing sketches of children. And so I had to interrupt her. I said, there's somebody here and she said, well, the painting's on the back of the partition. He bought it on the spot. It didn't matter what it cost, but I don't.
Yeah, I can't sell conventional artwork.
But can you imagine for a second, now all of you here, just putting that on your living room wall? Questions? Yes.
You said that the Iroquois allowed and encouraged the Delaware to settle here. Why would they do that?
The reason they did that was by the 1730s and 40s, the Iroquois militarily were losing their power. They were, at one time, the Iroquois nation. They had conquered the Huron in Canada. They had laid Canada to waste in the 1640s and 50s. They were, by uniting together, these 5 tribes united together, they were, in the 1600s, were unstoppable. And they were armed by the Dutch from Albany, and then the English they allied with. But they were starting to lose their military grip on things by the 1700s. Still something to be reckoned with. But they couldn't send war parties now down into Ohio to drive every band of Indians. And so the Delaware were being squeezed in the east. And I can't think of where the council was at, but in the late 1740s, before the war started, the Iroquois attended a council in which they chastised the Delaware, calling them, "You're our children, you're women wearing petticoats. You have no right to sell any land, or to give land away, we decide that. You see, and they could at any time destroy the Delaware, where Rome was not able to do that.
So the treaty that said that we wouldn't allow white men on the west side of the Ohio River, that was a treaty with the Iroquois?
Later, yes, 1768, or no, 1763, much later, 1763, after the French and Indian War, when the English claimed all of North America, this part of North America, the English said in 1763, the proclamation of 1763 forbid any settlement west of the crest of the Alleghenies, and said, no, you can't, this is Iroquois land, but they couldn't enforce it. And if you were, there's always, the neat thing about history is there's always two sides to every coin. We don't have to live it so we can see that. If you had come from Ireland or Wales, and you were indentured like my ancestor was, you're never going to own anything. You're going to work for somebody else all your life. And there's no land to be bought anyway. It was all taken up. And so a chance to come across the mountains, the British couldn't stop it. So 5 years later, in 1768, the Treaty of Fort Stanwix between the Iroquois and the British government extended it from the crest of the Alleghenies to the Ohio River. There was just a problem with it. The Iroquois now, by 1768, weren't occupying any of it. And they sold it to the English and they, without consulting the Delaware or the Shawnee, especially the Shawnee, who were upset about it. So yeah, Indians never got along with each other. Yes?
Are we assuming, you alluded to the fact that nobody wrote down the skull post? Are we assuming there was a skull on the post at some time, and one of the Indians saw it and started oral history of that?
There's no record anywhere, period, of anyone seeing a skull on its head. What there is a record of is Indians talking about it. And I presume that part, because it was such a rare thing. This book took 2 years to write. I researched a year and a half of it through colonial records, the handful of white men living with the Indians, or emissaries to the Indians, that this was such a rare occurrence, and that Indians talked about it, and that the Iroquois talked about it, that it had to have happened, but that it was symbolic. If you take a deer skull and hang it outside in the weather, this is not something that's going to be there forever. It's not going to be there anymore in a couple of years. So, the answer is there's no proof for that. I presumed that as I went to research about skulls on posts, that part of the legend was true. And the interesting thing in the book is, here's where I plug the book. I really shouldn't say anything, because if I do, the book will end up being half price. But there is one instance, a very, very interesting instance, where a white man named Conrad Weiser in the 1730s accompanied a group of Iroquois through Pennsylvania to go to the Onondaga, New York, which was the center of Iroquois culture. And they were walking a trail, and the Iroquois got upset. They said ahead on that mountaintop was two skulls on posts, and that these were prisoners who escaped and killed their captors. These were Catawba Indians, and that an evil spirit. So and Conrad Weiser wrote all this down. So there's a very clear analogy to Wheeling in Iroquois mythology and Iroquois history, that they told him the moral story, and then they said, we have to pass by quickly. There's an evil spirit here. So, something I should say to you, I don't want anyone walking away from here thinking that I'm saying, because this has come up, that Wheeling is an evil place. Knowing how stories get started, and knowing that there's a couple people here who would like to start that.
You've had no dealings with the city of Wheeling.
Right. Let's remember one thing. Ebenezer Zane said that this was a vision of paradise. He survived and prospered. And Wheeling's here because of his efforts. Other settlers came after the war. So that this was an Indian thing, not a white man's thing. And so you can't, because I floated this idea or talked about it without clarifying, and somebody says, I knew it, Wheeling is an evil place. I said, no. Every place has problems.
No, it's a vision of paradise.
Any last questions? I'd like to mention that the book is available at the Artisan Center on Market and Main. It's also available at Words and Music. And I've got a couple copies here with me today. I could sign for you too. But you can get those other two books. And there's two other I've written. One on the terrible war that went on here for 7 years. And this is available at Artisan and Words and Music. And my second book, In Their Own Words, which is a collection of things that Indians said. Thanks so much.
Dick here to tell you about our happening. Lunch with books. Lunch with books has books and hooks and hacks and cracks and yawns and sings and rocks and swings and more and more. Lunch with books. Lunch with books. At the Ohio County Public Library in Wheeling, West Virginia. Make you feel like yoga. Hey, yogi, 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 yogi. Hey, yogi, yogi, mostly on Tuesdays at noon. Bring your lunch. We'll provide the pop. And it's all free. Lunch with books. Knowledge is served.